Guys, we're going to be reading The Civilized Five to Freddy's Spice Car Coffin. Now let's get right into it. I hope you enjoy. Bye.
He sees me. Charlie dropped to her hands and knees. She was wedged behind a row of arcade games. Cramped in the crawl space between the consoles and the wall, tangled electrical cords and useless plugs strewn beneath her. She was cornered. The only way out was past the thing, and she wasn't fast enough to make it. She could see him stalking back and forth, catching flickers of movement through the gaps between the games. There was scarcely enough room to move, but she tried to crawl backward. Her foot caught on a cord. She stopped, contorting herself to carefully dislodge it. She heard the clash of metal on metal, and the farthest console rocked back against the wall. He hit it again, shattering the display. Then attacked the next, crashing against them almost rhythmically, tearing through the machinery, coming closer. I have to get out. I have to. The panicked thought was no help. There was no way out. Her arm ached, and she wanted to sob aloud. Blood soaked through the tattered bandage, and it seemed as though she could feel it draining out of her. The console, a few feet away, crashed against the wall, and Charlie flinched. He was getting closer. She could hear the grinding gears and the clicking of servos ever louder. Eyes closed, she could still see the way he looked at her. See the matted fur and the exposed metal beneath the cynic flesh. Suddenly, the console in front of her was wrenched away. It toppled over and threw down like a toy. The power cords beneath her hands and knees were yanked away, and Charlie slipped, almost falling. She caught herself and looked up just in time to see the downward swing of a hook. Welcome to Hurricane, Utah. Charlie smiled wryly at the sign and kept driving. The world didn't look any different from one side to the sign to the other. But she felt a nervous anticipation as she passed it. She didn't recognize anything. Then again, she hadn't really expected to. Not this far at the edge of town. It was all highway and empty space. She wondered what the others would look like. Who they would know. Then years ago, they had been best friends. And then it happened. And everything ended. At least for Charlie. She hadn't seen any of them since she was 7 years old. They had ridden all the time as kids, especially Marla, who wrote like she talked, fast and incoherent. But as they got older, they had grown apart. The letters had grown fewer and further between, and the conversations leading up to this trip had been perfunctory and full of awkward pauses. Charlie repeated their names as though to reassure herself she still remembered them. Marla, Jessica, Lamar, Carlton, John, and Michael. Michael was the reason for this trip after all. It was 10 years since he died. 10 years since it happened, and now his parents wanted them all together for the dedication ceremony. They wanted all his old friends there when they announced the scholarship they were creating in his name. Charlie knew it was a good thing to do, but the gathering still felt macabre. She shivered and turned down the air conditioning, even though she knew it was not the cold. As she drove down to the center, Charlie began recognizing things, a few stores and a movie theater, which was now advertising the summer's blockbuster hit. She felt a brief moment of surprise. Then she smiled to herself. What did you expect? The whole place would be unchanged? a monument to the moment of your departure, frozen forever in July 1985. Well, that was exactly what she had expected. She looked at her watch, still a few hours to kill before they all met up. She thought about going to a movie, but she knew she really wanted to do. Charlie made a left turn and headed downtown. 10 minutes later, she pulled a stop and got out. The house loomed before her. The dark outlined a wound in the bright blue sky. Charlie leaned back against the car, slightly dizzy. She took a moment to steady herself with deep breaths. She had known it would be here, and ill it looked. Though her aunt's bank books a few years ago were paying property taxes, it had only been 10 years. There was no reason it should have changed at all. Charlie climbed the steps slowly, taking in the peeling paint. The third stair still had a loose board, and the rosebush had taken over one side of the porch, the thorns biting hungrily into the lid. The door was locked, but Charlie still had her key. She had never actually used it, as she took it from around her neck and slid it into the lock. She remembered her father putting its keychain around her neck, in case you ever need it. Well, she needed it now. The door opened easily, and Charlie looked around. She didn't remember much from the first couple of years here. She'd only been 3 years old, and all the memories had faded together in the blur of the child's grief and loss. Of not understanding why her mother had to go away, clinging to her father every moment, not trusting the world around her unless was there. Unless she was holding tightly to him, burying herself into his flannel shirt and the smell of grease and hot metal and him. The stairs stretched straight up in front of her, but she did not move. Directly to them instead, she went into the living room, where all the furniture was still in place. She had not really noticed it as a child, but the house was a little too large for the furniture they had. Things were far from the couch to reach, the easy chair too far across the room to carry on a conversation. There was a dark stain in the wooden floorboards near the center of the room. Charlie slipped around it quickly and went into the kitchen, where the cupboards held only a few pots and pans and dishes. Charlie had never felt the lack of anything as a child, but it seemed unnecessary, and enormity of the house was a sort of apology, the attempt of a man who lost so much to give his daughter what he could. He had always had a way of overdoing whatever he did. The last time he was here, the house had been dark and everything felt wrong. She was carried up the stairs to her bedroom, although she was 7 years old and could have gone quicker on her own 2 feet. Valentine had stopped on the front porch, picked her up, and carried her, shielding her face as though she was a baby in the glaring sun. In her room, Aunt Jen sat Charlie down and closed the bedroom door behind them. She told her to pack her suitcase, and Charlie had cried because all her things could never fit into that small case. "We could come back for the rest later," Aunt Jen said, her impatience leaking through as Charlie hovered indecisively at her dresser, trying to decide what T-shirts to bring along. They had never come back for the rest. Charlie mounted the stairs, heading to her old bedroom. The door was practically cracked, and as she opened it, she had a giddy feeling of displacement, as her younger self might be sitting there among her toys. Might look up and ask Charlie, "Who are you?" Charlie went in. Like the rest of the house, her bedroom was untouched. The walls were pale pink, and the ceiling, which sloped down dramatically on the side to against the wall beneath a large window. The mattress was still intact, though the sheets were gone. The window was cracked slightly open, and rotting lace curtains wavered in the gentle breeze from the outside. There was a dark water stain in the paint beneath the window, where the weather had gotten in over the years, betraying the house neglect. Charlie climbed onto the bed and forced the window shut. It obeyed with a screech, and Charlie stepped back and turned her attention to the rest of the room, to her father's creations. Their first night in the house, Charlie had been afraid to sleep alone. She did not remember the night, but her father had told her about it often, enough that the story had taken on the quality of memory. She sat up and wailed until her father came to find her, until she scooped her up and held her and promised he would make sure she was never alone again. The next morning he took her by the hand and led her to the garage, where he set to work keeping that promise. The first of his inventions was the purple rabbit, now gray with age. From years of sitting in the sunlight, her father had named him Theodore. He was the size of a 3-year-old child, her size at the time, and he had plush fur, shining eyes, and dapper red bow tie. He didn't do much, only waved a hand and tilted his head to the side and said in her father's voice, "I love you, Charlie." But it was enough to give her a night watcher, someone to keep her company when she cannot sleep. Right now, Theodore sat in a white wicker chair far from the room. Charlie waved at him, but not activated. He did not wave back. After Theodore, the toys got more complex. Some worked and some did not. Some seemed to have permanent glitches, while others simply did not appeal to Charlie's childish imagination. She knew her father took those back, added to his workshop, and recycled them for parts. Though she did not like to watch them be dismantled, but the ones that were kept, those she loved, they were here now, looking at her expectantly, smiling. Charlie pushed a button beside her bed. It gave away stiffly, but nothing happened. She pushed it again, holding it down longer, and this time across the room, and with a wavery creak of metal on metal, the unicorn began to move. The unicorn. Charlie had named him Stanley. For some reason she could no longer remember. Was made of metal and had been painted glossy white. He trotted around the room on a circular track, bobbling with his head stiffly up and down. The track squealed as Stanley rounded the corner and came to a stop beside the bed. Nolly knelt beside him on the floor and petted his flank. His glossy paint was chipped and peeling, and his face had given over to rust. His eyes were lively, gazing out of the decay. You need a new coat of paint, Stanley, Charlie said. The unicorn stared ahead, unresponsive. At the foot of the bed there was a wheel, made of patched-together metal. It had always reminded her of something she might find on a submarine. Charlie turned it. It stuck for a moment, then gave away, rotating as it always did. And across the room, the smallest closet door swung open. Out sailed Ella on her track, a childish-sized doll, bearing a teacup and saucer in her tiny hands. With an offering, Ella's plaid dress was still crisp, and her patent leather shoes still shone. Perhaps the closet had protected her from the damage of the damp. Charlie had an identical outfit back when she and Ella were the same height. "Hi, Ella," she said softly. As the wheel unwound, Ella retreated to the closet and had been built to align with the slant of the ceiling, and there were the three of them. Ella lived in a short one, which was about 3.5 feet tall. Next to it was a foot or so taller, and a third closet to the bedroom. That was the same height as the rest of the room, she smiled, remembering. "Why do you have 3 closets?" John had demanded the first time he came over. She looked at him blankly, confused by the question. "'Cause that's how many there are," she said finally. She pointed defensively at the littlest one. That one's Ella's, anyway, she added, John nodded satisfied. Charlie shook her head and opened the door in the middle closet, or tried to. The doorknob stopped with a jolt. It was locked. She rattled it a few times, but gave up without much of a conviction. She stayed crouched below the floor and glanced up at the tallest closet. Her big girl closet that she someday grew into. You won't need it until you're bigger, her father would say. But that day never came. The door now hung open slightly, but Charlie didn't disturb it. It hadn't opened for her. It had only given way to time. As she moved to stand, she noticed something shiny, half hidden under a rim of the locked middle door. She leaned forward to pick it up slightly. Nuts, bolts, and scraps and parts had turned up all over the place. Once upon a time, her father always had stray parts in his pockets. He'd forget where it was, or worse, put something aside for safekeeping. She unwound it carefully in her tiny lip of metal it was stuck on. Finally, as though she had been putting it off, Charlie crossed the room and picked up the oar. His back was not faded in the sun like the front of his body. It was the same rich darker purple as she remembered. She pressed the button on the base of his neck, but he remained lifeless, his fur as threadbare, on one ear hanging loose by a single rotating thread, and through the hole she could see the green plastic of the circuit board. Charlie held her breath, listening fearfully for something. I-O-Lie, the rabbit said, with a barely audible halting noise, and Charlie sat down, her face hot and her chest pinched tight. She had not really expected to hear her father's voice again. I love you too. Charlie looked around the room. When she was a child, she'd been her own magical world, and she possessive of it. Only a few chosen friends were ever allowed inside. She went to her bed, and Stanley moving on his track again. She left, closing the door behind her before a little unicorn came to a halt. She went out the back door to the driveway and stopped in front of the garage that had been her father's workshop, half buried in the gravel, was jointed in the middle. Then she held in her hand, smiling as she bent back and forth. An elbow joint, she thought. I wonder who that was going to belong to. She had stood in the exact same spot many times before. She closed her eyes and the memory overwhelmed her. She was a little girl again, sitting on the floor at her father's workshop, playing with scraps of wood and metal as though they were toy blocks, trying to build a tower with uneven pieces. The shop was hot. She was sweaty grime sticking to her legs as she sat in her shorts and sneakers. She could almost smell the sharp metallic odor in the soldering iron. Her father was nearby, never out of sight, working on Stanley the unicorn. Stanley's face was still unfinished, one side white and shining and friendly, with a gleaming brown eye that seemed almost to see. The other half of the toy's face was all exposed, circuits, boards, and metal parts. Charlie's father looked at her and smiled, and she smiled back. Beloved, in a dark corner behind her father, barely visible, hung a jumble of metal limbs, a twisted skeleton with burning silver eyes. Every once in a while, it gave an uncanny twitch. Carly tried never to look at it, but as her father worked, as she played with her makeshift toys, her eye was drawn back to it again and again. The limbs contorted and seemed almost mocking. The thin, ghastly gesture, and yet there was something about it that suggested enormous pain. Daddy, Charlie said, and her father did not look up from his work. "Daddy," she said again, more urgently, and this time he turned to her, slowly, as she fully present in the world. "What do you need, sweetie?" She pointed at the milk skeleton. "Does it hurt?" She wanted to ask the question, but when she looked in her father's eyes, she found she could not. She shook her head. "Nothing." He nodded at her with an absent smile and went back to his work. Behind him, the creature gave another awful twitch, and its eyes still burned. Charlie shivered and drew herself back to the present. She glanced behind her, feeling exposed. She looked down at her gaze and fixed on something, 3 wildly spaced grooves in the ground. She knelt thoughtfully and ran her finger over one of them. The gravel was scattered away, the mark worn heavily into the dirt. A camera tripod of some sort. It was the first familiar thing she'd seen. The door to the inside. Quickly, she'd headed back to her car. But she stopped as soon as fallen out of her pocket somewhere inside the house. She retraced her steps and merely glancing into the living room and kitchen. Before they headed up to her bedroom, the keys were on the wicker chair. Beside Theodore, the rabbit. She picked them up and jangled them for a moment, not quite ready to leave this room behind. She sat down on the bed. Stanley the unicorn had stopped beside the bed, as he always did. And as she sat, she patted him absently on the head. It had grown dark while she was outside, and the room was now cast in shadows. Somehow, without the bright of sunlight, the toy's flaws and deterioration were thrown into sharp relief. Theodore's eyes no longer shone, and his thin fur and hanging ear made him look like a sickly vagabond. With hollow sockets in his bare teeth, which she had always thought of as a careful not to touch him, and he hurried toward the door, but her foot caught on the wheel beside the bed. She tripped on the tracks and fell sprawlingly on the floor. It was a whirl of a spinning metal, and as she raised it, her head and a small pair of feet appeared under her nose. Clad in shining patient leather, she looked up. There above her was Ella, staring down at her, silent and uninvited, her glassy eyes almost appearing to see. The teacup saucer were held out before her in her military stiffness. Charlie got up cautiously, taking care not to be disturbed, the doll. She left the rooms, stepping carefully to avoid the absent, deactivating any other toys. As Charlie went, Ella retreated to her closet, almost matching her pace. Charlie hurried down the stairs and seized by an urgency to get away and back to fast down the driveway, running recklessly over the grass of their front yard and sped away. After about a mile, Charlie pulled over on the shoulder and turned the car off. Staring straight ahead through the windshield, her eyes focused on nothing. Guys, thank you for watching Silver Eyes Chapter 1, Part 1. Thank you. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Bye, guys. Don't let me down. Don't let me down.